let's just start, if you don't mind, give me a brief explanation, if you will, of the lawsuit and the purpose for the lawsuit.
So the lawsuit that we filed a little over a week ago is a follow-up to our earlier efforts to challenge the citizenship question, which, as you just indicated, was resolved by the Supreme Court, though there was a little bit of interplay afterwards with the Trump administration about whether it would try to meet the standards set by the Supreme Court. But when the president ultimately indicated he would no longer seek to put a question on the census in 2020, as you know, he released an executive order that directed the Secretary of Commerce and the Census Bureau to use administrative records, both federal and state records, to attempt to put together a database of citizenship data that would allow, as he said, jurisdictions that might be interested to draw their districts, their political districts, based on voter population or something other than total population, which has been the practice pretty much universally throughout the country. So our lawsuit challenges that order to collect that citizenship data as a violation of both the Constitution and the Administrative Procedure Act.
And what's the specific objection? Is it the concern that by finding a way to exclude people who are U.S. citizens, people who may be undocumented or for some other reason don't have legal documentation to be in the country, that that we're somehow skewing ultimately who gets represented? Is the concern that there is a kind of racial or at least immigrant status kind of angle that the administration is pursuing here?
So the executive order does say that it will be collecting citizenship data. So I don't think that they'll be able, though they may attempt, to collect status data. So it would simply distinguish between citizens and non-citizens, and that of course includes lots of lawful permanent residents, refugees, asylees, others who don't have citizenship, though they are not undocumented. And it would certainly also exclude the undocumented. But the bottom line problem is that the whole purpose of collecting the data and making it available is to discriminate against the Latino community, just as we contended that the evidence showed that the attempt to put a citizenship question on the census itself was driven by a racially discriminatory intent, specifically the attempt to reduce the count of Latinos, to reduce Latino political representation. And this new effort has the same effect and driven by the same intent.
And where specifically is the suit right now? It's where was it filed, and how long will it take to start to make its way through the process?
So it was filed a little over a week ago, and we filed in federal court in Maryland. We filed in Maryland because that's where the Census Bureau is located. We also filed our case against the citizenship question in Maryland. And this new case has just been reassigned to the same judge who heard and tried our citizenship question case, Judge Hazel. How long will it take to get going? It'll take a little bit. We're just getting started. There is some urgency, but certainly not the same urgency as surrounded the citizenship question, since the Bureau was in the process, as you know, in July of finalizing the questionnaire so that it could be printed and ready for use in early 2020. This effort doesn't have to be completed under the executive order seemingly until closer to the end of 2020. Nonetheless, there is some urgency about getting the matter resolved. So we do expect to be moving with alacrity, though we probably won't be getting started for a number of weeks.
Is there some concern by either your organization or perhaps other Latino leadership in the country that by simply filing, or rather by simply pursuing the route that the administration is pursuing and the publicity that surrounds it and so on and so forth, that it puts a chilling effect, if you will, on the community and anyone who has a concern that may be remaining, that citizenship information will somehow make its way to other federal departments, including the Immigration Department?
Well, I think there's no question that this administration has made gathering the data through the census harder than it otherwise would be. We've known that even before they attempted to add the citizenship question, where the atmosphere of fear in immigrant communities created by the rhetoric and policies of the Trump administration already were appearing to the Census Bureau to affect the Bureau's ability to collect data. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in light of that continuing atmosphere, exacerbated, as you've suggested, by this very public attempt to try to collect citizenship data, first through the question on the 2020 questionnaire, and now through administrative records. So it does create serious barriers to getting a complete count, and there's going to be significant need for significant outreach and education efforts so that folks are aware that federal law is quite clear and ironclad that you may not misuse census data for any purpose other than aggregating that data to create the data tables, the population information that the Census Bureau is obligated to produce. So that law is clear, but understandably some folks are not aware of that law or don't trust the administration to follow the law. And a lot of work needs to be done to reassure folks that that law is ironclad and it is important and safe to fill out the census form.
Is there, that you're aware of, a formalized effort by perhaps a coalition of organizations to combat that perception or that perhaps misunderstanding by the general community that this information could be misused in that way? I mean, is there an organized effort? And I'm aware, of course, that on a grassroots level, there are many organizations, Latino related organizations and non-Latino related organizations that are pushing to make sure that folks get counted in the census. And that the Census Bureau itself has been actually working on the ground with some of those grassroots groups to raise awareness. But is there a national effort, perhaps by Latino organizations or a multicultural group, that is really trying to counter the damage that may have been done by this whole debate over the census question?
I think there are a number of groups at the national level and, as you've mentioned, at the local level that are working together and will be sharing information. And a part of these census outreach campaigns is always, and particularly important in this census, is always about the confidentiality of the data. Because there are other reasons wholly apart from the Trump administration that we have to reiterate. This data is safe and must remain confidential. Another reason, for example, is this is the first digital census in the sense of most folks will respond through the internet in filling out their household census form. In past censuses, it was mostly, if not entirely, done by paper submission. So doing this through the cyber world already creates anxieties about confidentiality. So confidentiality, and specifically the laws and the efforts to protect the confidentiality of data, are a central part of the education and outreach campaigns being led by organizations from within and outside the Latino community, including, as you've mentioned, the Census Bureau itself, going on, and it will go on across the country at all levels of engagement.
Okay, great. Before we close, I'd like to switch gears just a bit in terms of some of the general work that MALDEF is doing. You guys have been around for decades, of course, and have been involved in so many of the significant civil rights steps and advances that have been made in the country, and not just related to the Latino community, but of course, very specifically and many times. What is MALDEF up to now in terms of the significant work it's doing around the country? What is the most vital work that it's doing? And do you feel that that work in some ways is now just as important perhaps as it has been over the decades?
Well, we're at the end of commemorating our 50th anniversary. We were founded in 1968, so we've gone through a year of commemorating that. And one thing that has struck me is so many of our leaders from early in the organization's existence have noted that they would have hoped and believed that the organization would be less needed in 2018-19 than when it was founded a half a century earlier. But to a person, they recognize that our efforts are as much needed now as ever. And that's precisely because of the atmosphere created by the Trump administration. This is the most anti-Latino, Latino-phobic presidential administration in our history. And we see it every day. And it started even before Donald Trump was inaugurated. It started, as you know, in the middle of 2015 when he announced his campaign with a slur against all Mexican immigrants. And then a year later, compounded that by accusing a federal judge, a very respected federal judge, of being biased simply because that judge is Mexican American. And certainly since he was inaugurated, we've seen a steady stream of anti-immigrant, anti-Latino rhetoric from this administration. And that has repercussions. So we've been involved in a number of ways in combating that. Central to that are these census efforts, the citizenship question case, where we were the only case that raised a conspiracy allegation, conspiracy to discriminate against the Latino community. We had the only viable living racial intent claim when the Supreme Court issued its ruling, meaning the possibility of that evidence coming forward, I believe, played a role in the administration abandoning its efforts. We now have this new case. We are involved as among the first interveners in a case in Alabama, where the state of Alabama is contending that the undocumented population specifically should be estimated and subtracted from census data before the first post-census action is taken, which is to reassign the 435 seats in the House of Representatives among the states. We've also been involved and are still involved in combating anti-immigrant laws and initiatives at state and local and now federal level around the country. And of course, the attempts to suppress voter participation only begin with the census. We have had to challenge so many changes in recent years designed to prevent Latinos from participating in the vote. One particularly important case was one within the last 6 months, challenging an attempt to purge nearly 100,000 voters from the Texas rolls simply because those voters had gotten a driver's license, obtained a driver's license before they were citizens, even though the vast majority of them had naturalized and then registered to vote. So we're engaged in activities, I believe, important activities across the country to combat the really dangerous anti-Latino atmosphere we're currently living in.
And do you work closely, I think I know the answer to this, but do you work closely with other organizations such as the ACLU, NAACP, organizations obviously that have their own long track records of fighting for some of the same causes you do? Do you work closely with them?
So we do try to coordinate among all the groups that are involved in these efforts to ensure that we can be as efficient and effective as possible. Sometimes that means foregoing involvement in a case that's being handled quite well by another organization. Sometimes, though, we do intervene or file our own litigation, recognizing that the particular perspective of the Latino community is necessary and should be represented in particular litigation. For example, the Alabama case that I mentioned, there are other interveners, other civil rights organizations representing local and state government, but we felt it was important that the Latino community be represented in defending against this Alabama attempt to completely discount such a large portion of our community.
What do you see coming down the road? We have another year and 2 months, at least, of this administration. And I think that universally people who follow civil rights and the civil rights advances that have been made over the particularly last 5 or 6 decades, understand that this is an administration that is hostile towards many of those advances that were made. But are there other threats on the horizon besides the Trump administration? What do you see coming down the pipe between now and, say, the next election?
Donald Trump just epitomizes what we've seen previously in various states, including here in California, where I'm sitting, which is now viewed as a very progressive, almost anti-Trump state. And it certainly is that. But 25 years ago, it had Proposition 187, which was, at the time, the most anti-immigrant state law ever adopted. And it was championed by Pete Wilson, who built his re-election campaign around that very anti-Latino, anti-immigrant measure. 25 years later, as I said, California has changed and is viewed as a counterweight to the Trump administration. But what we saw with Pete Wilson, and we later saw in Arizona less than a decade ago in the era of SB 1070, we're now just seeing on a national level. And that is the irresponsible exploitation by political figures of demographic fear of the growth of the Latino community. So that's still real, and there are still going to be political leaders who irresponsibly attempt to exploit for short-term gain those demographic fears. So I think that there will be a continued need, even once the Trump administration ends, not just to reverse the very bad policies put in place by the administration, but to look for other efforts in states around the country. Alabama may be one of them, for example, where new political leaders will seek to exploit fear of the Latino community to engage in irresponsible policy making and dangerous rhetoric.
And if we may close out with a kind of a question that's sort of directed at other communities, if you will, that have been facing some of the same conflicts with the Trump administration. The Muslim community, of course, at one point the president suggested all Muslims on the planet be banned from entering the United States, and then there were a series of rulings or decisions by the administration to try to limit some of their community coming into the country. And there have been conflicts, obviously, with other immigrant populations and other communities of color. Do you see a kind of successful, concerted pushback by the various communities with regards to these kinds of pressures and these kinds of threats that have been directed their way? And how does that tie in with the work that you do?
So I think Donald Trump's targeting so many different groups has really brought folks together across groups, across organizations, to successfully combat so many of these initiatives. Obviously, there have been some successes that later were taken away, for example, against the Muslim ban by the Supreme Court. But there's still important coalitional work going on out of recognition that the Trump administration is, well, focused on specific communities, really in many ways scattershot in its hostility towards so many of the groups that have faced historically discrimination in this country. It is a white supremacist administration. I think that's its defining characteristic, but that has resulted in coalition efforts, I think, that have and will continue to bear important fruit. Even within the Latino community, which you know is diverse, we have all come together recognizing, and as we work together over years and years, but there is a clear recognition that while he may have started by slandering Mexican immigrants, his hostility to the Latino community extends across the board. There's no greater indication of that than his really irresponsible treatment of emergencies and disasters on the island of Puerto Rico. Mm-hmm. Puerto Ricans are, as you know, citizens. They don't have any immigration issues. So no one can say that Donald Trump's anti-Latino sentiment only manifests in anti-immigrant policy. It manifests in hostility to everyone who is Latino. And it manifests in hostility to other communities, as you've mentioned. Some communities that overlap, the Muslim community, for example, with the Latino community, and others that have a long history of working together with us. So I think we have built enduring coalitions. They have been strengthened in the last 4 years, and they will go forward equally strong, if not stronger, to combat additional attempts by this administration or anyone else to target vulnerable communities in our nation.
Well, Thomas Saenz, I really want to thank you for your time. I appreciate you covering all the ground you did, and I'd love to follow up as things move along, particularly on the census-related questions and so forth. Thank you very much, and congratulations on the organization's 50th anniversary.